The first time Landon Zeller saw the orc woman speak with her hands, he was standing in the herb garden behind his apothecary at dawn, watching frost melt off the feverfew leaves, and he looked up to find her conversing in silence with old Garrett, the deaf farmhand who brought him rosehips twice a month. Her fingers moved with a grace that made the air itself seem to listen, shaping words Landon had never learned to read, and Garrett's weathered face broke into a smile that told Landon whatever she had signed was kind. She caught Landon staring, and her hands went still, dropping to her sides like birds shot mid-flight. And in that sudden stillness, he saw something he recognized. The wariness of someone who had learned that being noticed often meant being hurt. Garrett turned and waved Landon over, his own hands moving in the language Landon knew only in fragments, the few signs the old man had taught him over years of trading herbs for berries. Landon walked through rows of monkshood and valerian, his boots crunching the frost-stiff grass, and when he reached them, Garrett pointed to the orc woman and finger spelled a name, Thalia. Then Garrett's hands moved in broader signs, and Landon caught the words for work, help, and garden. He looked at the woman, Thalia, and saw she was watching his face with an intensity that made him feel transparent. She was tall but not imposing, built lean and strong like someone who had worked her whole life, her green skin darker than spring leaves, closer to pine bark in shadow. Small tusks curved up from her lower jaw, barely longer than a child's first teeth, and her pointed ears were pierced with simple wooden studs. She wore a rough wool dress and an oilcloth apron, both patched and faded, and her black hair was tied back in a thick braid that hung to her waist. Landon nodded once, then signed the word for welcome, one of the few he knew. Thalia's eyes widened slightly, surprise flickering across her face, and she signed something back that he did not understand. Garrett laughed, a silent huffing through his nose, and fingers spelled SHEASKSIFYOUKNOWMORE. Landon shook his head and signed the word for small, holding his thumb and forefinger an inch apart. Thalia's mouth quirked at one corner, not quite a smile, and she nodded. Garrett explained in halting speech, the thick consonants of someone who had lost his hearing as a young man and learned to talk from memory, that Thalia needed work and new herbs, that she could not speak but had good hands. Landon looked at those hands, saw the scars across the knuckles and the calluses on her palms, and thought of all the hours he spent alone in his workroom grinding roots and measuring tinctures, speaking to no one, and said yes. She started the next morning. Landon showed her the garden's layout, pointing to each bed, and naming the plants aloud even though he knew she could not answer, his voice rough from disuse because he lived alone and rarely spoke except to customers. She watched his mouth as he talked, then knelt and touched the leaves of comfrey, of wormwood, of rue, her fingers brushing them with a care that told him she knew what she was handling. When he brought her to the drying shed, she examined the bundles hanging from the rafters and signed something quick and fluid. He shook his head, helpless, and she looked frustrated for a moment, then patient. She picked up a stalk of dried lavender and made a gesture like water pouring, then pointed to the flowers and shook her head. He understood. The lavender had been overwatered before harvest, weakening its oil. She was right. He had known it when he cut it, but had needed the space in the garden. He nodded and watched her eyes brighten with the small victory of being understood. That night, after she left and walked the long road back to whatever place she was staying, Landon sat at his kitchen table with a candle burning low and opened the wooden box where he kept Garrett's old notes. Years ago, when Landon had first taken over the apothecary from his father, Garrett had written out a list of basic signs and their meanings, crude sketches of hand shapes and arrows showing movement. Landon had glanced at them once and set them aside, figuring he and Garrett had managed well enough with pointing and writing. Now he spread the papers across the table and began to study. The signs for yes and no, for more and enough, for please and thank you. The alphabet finger spelled letter by letter. He practiced in the candlelight until his fingers cramped, shaping the letters of his own name of hers. The next day when Thalia arrived he signed good morning to her, clumsy and slow, and she stopped in the doorway of the apothecary's shop, her hand lifting to her mouth in surprise. Then she signed it back, correcting the angle of his wrist, and he copied her until he got it right. She smiled, a real smile that showed her tusks and made her eyes crinkle at the corners, and something in his chest that had been clenched for years loosened slightly. They worked through the morning in near silence, Landon mixing a salve for burns while Thalia harvested thyme and sorrel, and when he needed her to bring him beeswax, he tried to sign the request. He got it wrong, signing something that made her press her lips together to keep from laughing, and she showed him the correct sign, her hands miming the shape of a honeycomb. He nodded, feeling heat rise to his face, and she touched his shoulder lightly before going to fetch the wax, a gesture of reassurance that stayed with him the rest of the day. It became their pattern. Landon would learn a handful of signs each night, practicing by candlelight until the shapes felt almost natural, and each day he would try them on Thalia, stumbling through sentences that must have sounded like a toddler's first words. She never mocked him. She corrected him gently, her hands slow and clear, and when he managed a full thought she would nod with approval that felt earned. He learned the signs for the plants they worked with, for the tools they used, for the weather and the time of day. He learned that her signing had a rhythm to it, a flow that was almost musical, and that when she was excited or upset her hands moved faster, blurring into shapes he could not catch. 3 weeks after she started, a woman came into the shop with a sick child, a little girl burning with fever, and Landon examined her while the mother hovered anxiously at his elbow. He sent Thalia to the garden for willow bark and elderflower, and when she returned, she set the basket down and signed something to him, her face urgent. He caught the signs for hot and water and wait, and understood. Make the tea weak and let it cool before giving it to the child. The fever was too high to risk a strong dose heating her further. He nodded and did as she suggested, and the mother looked between them, her expression uncertain. "That orc understands medicine?" she asked, her tone hovering between suspicion and hope. Landon looked at Thalia, who had gone very still, her eyes on the floor, and he felt a flicker of anger at the woman's tone, at the way she said orc like it was a species of pest. "She knows more than most," Landon said, his voice flat. "I trust her with my stock." The mother said nothing more, but she watched Thalia with wary eyes until Landon handed her the cooled tea and instructions for dosing. After she left, Thalia began cleaning the counter with sharp, jerky movements, her jaw tight. Landon waited until she looked at him, then signed. "You were right. Good thinking." She stared at him for a long moment, her eyes searching his face for sarcasm or pity, and when she found neither, she nodded once and her shoulders relaxed. They went back to work. Landon had lived 32 years with a reputation for being cold. People in the village said he had inherited his father's skill with herbs and his mother's stony silence, that he could set a bone or stitch a wound without a flicker of expression, that he charged fair prices and never gossed but never warmed either. It was true enough. He had learned early that words were often wasted, that people heard what they wanted to hear and ignored what they did not, and he had grown comfortable in his quietness. But with Thalia, silence was not absence. Silence was the space where their hands could speak, where meaning was built sign by sign, where nothing was wasted because every gesture mattered. He found he liked it, the precision and the intimacy of it, the way they could hold a conversation across the length of the garden without a sound. One evening in late autumn, after the garden had been put to bed for winter and the shop was closed for the day, Thalia stayed late to help Landon inventory the dried stock in the workroom. They worked by lamplight, counting bundles of herbs and jars of tinctures, and when they finished, Landon realized he did not want her to leave yet. He signed, "Tea," and she nodded. He brewed a pot of chamomile and mint, and they sat at the work table, the steam rising between them. Landon had been practicing a question all week, working out the signs in the margins of his ledger, and now he made himself ask it. "How did you lose your voice?" Thalia's hands went still around her cup. She set it down carefully, her gaze dropping to the table, and for a long moment Landon thought she would not answer. Then her hands began to move, slow and deliberate. "Whip," she signed. "Years ago, overseer, plantation." She touched her throat, a gesture of absence. Voice ripped out. "Did not grow back." Landon felt something cold settle in his stomach. He signed, "I am sorry." The words felt pitifully small. Thalia looked at him, her expression unreadable, and signed, "Not your fault." Then, after a pause, "Not many ask. Easier to pretend I was born this way." He wanted to ask more, to know the details of how and why, but he could see the tension in her shoulders and the way her hands had curled into loose fists. Instead he signed, "You are safe here." It was a promise he had no right to make, no way to enforce, but he meant it with everything he had. Thalia studied his face for a long moment, then nodded once, and her hands relaxed. They finished their tea in silence, the comfortable kind, and when she finally left, he stood in the doorway and watched her walk down the road until the darkness swallowed her shape. Winter came hard that year, the kind of cold that made the ground ring like iron and the frost flowers bloom on the window glass. Thalia kept coming to the shop every day, trudging through snow that came up to her knees, and Landon stopped pretending he hired her only for the work. He liked her company, liked the way she moved through the space they shared with quiet efficiency, liked the conversations they had in signs that grew more complex as his vocabulary expanded. He learned that she had worked on a flax plantation in the Southern Territories until she saved enough to buy her freedom, that she had walked north through 2 provinces looking for a place that would hire her, that she had been surviving on odd jobs and charity until Garrett brought her to Landon's door. He learned that she was 26, that she missed the sound of rain on leaves but not the sound of voices, that she had a sense of humor that came through in the wry tilt of her eyebrows and the exaggerated shapes of her signs when she was teasing him. He told her things too, in halting signs that she helped him find words for. About his father dying of lung rot when Landon was 19, and leaving him the apothecary and a reputation to uphold. About his mother remarrying and moving to the coast. About the loneliness of being the person people came to when they were desperate, but never when they were happy. Thalia listened with her whole body, her eyes never leaving his hands, and when he finished she signed, "Lonely too." Same. It was the simplest statement of kinship he had ever received, and it meant more than poetry. One afternoon in midwinter, a man came into the shop while Landon was in the back room straining a batch of cough syrup. Thalia was at the front counter, writing out labels for the jars of salve they had finished that morning, and Landon heard the door chime and the heavy tread of boots. He glanced through the doorway and saw a broad-shouldered man in a wool coat, his beard flecked with gray, his eyes scanning the shelves with the confidence of someone used to being obeyed. Thalia looked up and went rigid, her hand frozen on the pen, and the man's gaze landed on her like a blow. "Well," the man said, his voice carrying the drawl of the Southern Territories. "Thalia Fenn, never thought I'd see you this far north." Thalia said nothing, could say nothing, but her eyes were wide and her breathing had gone shallow. Landon stepped into the front room, wiping his hands on a rag, and the man glanced at him with barely concealed dismissal. "Help you?" Landon asked, his tone carefully neutral. "Just surprised to see one of my old workers here," the man said, still looking at Thalia. "She run off from the plantation without a word, cost me a season's labor." "She bought her freedom," Landon said. "Legal and paid." The man shrugged. "If you say so. Hard to keep track of all the paper. Still, strange to see her pretending to be useful." He leaned against the counter and Thalia took a step back. She always was a lazy thing, had to encourage her to work properly. His smile did not reach his eyes. Landon felt his jaw tighten. "You need medicine, or are you here to talk?" The man straightened, his expression hardening. "I am here as magistrate of the Southern Canton, on business for the regional court. But I will remember your hospitality." He turned and walked out, the door slamming behind him, and Landon watched through the window as he crossed the square toward the courthouse. Thalia was shaking. Landon moved toward her and she flinched, then realized it was him and stopped. Her hands moved in a rush of signs, too fast for him to follow, and he signed, "Slow, please." She took a breath and started again. "That man, Matthias Garrett, overseer who whipped me, he destroyed my voice, he is here." Landon felt his stomach drop. "He is a magistrate now," she nodded, her face pale beneath the green. "Bought the position, respected here, I think." "Did you ever report what he did?" Thalia's laugh was silent, bitter. "Report to who? I was property, no voice, no rights. Who would believe an orc?" Landon wanted to say something reassuring, something that would undo the fear in her eyes, but the words did not exist. Instead he signed, "You are not alone now." It was all he had, and it was not enough, but she nodded and her hands stopped shaking quite so hard. The next week passed in tense quiet. Thalia came to work, but she was always looking over her shoulder, and Landon found himself watching the door with the same wariness. Matthias Garrett did not return to the shop, but Landon saw him in the village square twice, talking with the mayor and the regional tax collector, his manner easy and authoritative. It made Landon's skin crawl. Then, on a frozen morning in early spring, a farmer named Halleys came pounding on the apothecary door before dawn, his face wild with panic. Landon opened the door in his nightshirt, and Halleys gasped out that his daughter had been attacked on the road the night before, that she was hurt but alive, that she said it was the magistrate who did it. Landon's blood went cold. He dressed in seconds and followed Halleys to his farmstead, and found the girl, no older than 16, huddled by the fire with her mother. She was bruised and shaking, her dress torn, and when Landon examined her he felt a fury so deep it was almost calm. He treated her injuries, gave her a sedative tea, and told Halleys to bring her to the town physician for a full examination and record of her wounds. "Will you testify to what you have seen?" Halleys asked, his voice breaking. "Yes," Landon said. "But you will need more than my testimony about her injuries. You will need her to accuse him directly." The girl looked up from her tea, her eyes red-rimmed. "I will. I saw his face. I know it was him." Halleys brought a formal complaint to the village mayor, and the mayor had no choice but to forward it to the regional court. Matthias Garrett was called to answer the charges, and he came with a lawyer and an air of indignant offense. The hearing was set for 3 weeks away, time enough for both sides to gather evidence and witnesses. Landon told Thalia about it that evening, signing the news carefully, and she sat very still. "I was there," she signed. Landon stared at her. "Where?" "On the road. I saw it happen. I was walking home late. I hid when I heard the girl scream. I saw his face. I saw everything." Landon felt his heart hammering. "You are the only other witness." Thalia's hands moved bitterly. "I cannot testify. I cannot speak. No voice, no testimony. That is the law." Landon thought fast, his mind racing through the legal codes his father had taught him, the ones that governed contracts and disputes in the frontier provinces. The law says testimony must be given in words the court can understand. It does not specify spoken words. Thalia looked at him, hope and doubt warring in her eyes. "You think they will accept signs? If I translate, yes. I am a licensed apothecary, a man of standing in this village. My word holds weight. He will fight it. He will say I am lying, that you are lying for me. Then we will make sure your testimony is so detailed, so precise, that it cannot be dismissed." Landon leaned forward, his hands moving with urgency. "You saw it happen. You can describe what he wore, how he moved, the exact sequence of events. No one else can provide that." Thalia's hands trembled as she signed. "If I do this, he will come for me. He will destroy me." "He already tried to destroy you," Landon said, his signs sharp. "You survived. You built a life. You will not let him take that from you again." She looked at him for a long time, her eyes searching his, and then she nodded. "I will do it." The next 3 weeks were a blur of preparation. Landon and Thalia spent every evening going over her account of the attack, making sure every detail was clear and consistent, practicing the signs until Landon could translate them smoothly, without hesitation. They wrote everything down, cross-referenced it with the girl's testimony and the physical evidence. Hallie's daughter, her name was Emma, came to the shop twice to meet Thalia, and the two of them sat together in the workroom, Emma speaking and Thalia signing, and both of them sharing the grim kinship of survivors. Landon watched them and felt a fierce protectiveness that surprised him with its intensity. The hearing was held in the village courthouse on a cold morning when the wind rattled the shutters, and the sky was the color of old iron. The room was packed with villagers, some who supported Hallie's and some who could not believe a magistrate would commit such a crime. Matthias Garrett sat at the front with his lawyer, dressed in fine clothes, his expression calm and faintly amused. Emma sat with her parents, pale but determined. Thalia sat in the back row, her hands folded in her lap, and Landon sat beside her. The magistrate presiding over the case was an older man named Aldrich Thorne, brought in from the northern canton to ensure impartiality. He listened to Emma's testimony first, and she spoke clearly despite the tremor in her voice, describing the attack in detail, identifying Garrett as her attacker. Garrett's lawyer cross-examined her, suggesting she had been mistaken in the dark, that her trauma had confused her memory, but Emma did not waver. Then Landon was called to testify about the injuries he had treated, and he described them with clinical precision, noting their severity and placement, stating that they were consistent with Emma's account of the attack. Then the magistrate called for any further witnesses. Landon stood and said, "There is one more, Thalia Fenn. She witnessed the attack." The courtroom erupted in murmurs. Garrett's lawyer shot to his feet. "Thalia Fenn is a mute orc. She cannot give testimony." "She can give testimony in sign language," Landon said. "I will translate." The lawyer's face flushed with anger. "The court cannot accept the word of an orc relayed through a biased translator. This is absurd." Magistrate Thorne held up a hand for silence. "The law states that testimony must be given in words the court can understand. If Miss Fenn can provide testimony through sign language, and Mr. Zeller can translate accurately, I see no reason to disallow it. However, I will require corroboration of the translation. Is there anyone else present who understands sign language?" Garrett, the old farmhand, stood up from the middle of the room. He spoke in his thick, careful voice. "I know signs. I can confirm the translation." The magistrate nodded. "Very well. Miss Fenn, please come forward." Thalia stood slowly, her legs unsteady, and Landon walked with her to the front of the room. She stood before the magistrate, her hands at her sides, and Landon stood beside her, his heart pounding so hard he was sure the whole room could hear it. Matthias Garrett watched them with eyes like flint. The magistrate addressed Thalia directly. "Miss Fenn, please describe in your own words what you witnessed on the night in question." Thalia's hands began to move. Landon watched them, reading the signs as if they were written on the air, and spoke aloud. "I was walking home from the village on the north road. It was late, past full dark. I heard a scream ahead. I hid behind the oak tree at the crossroads." Thalia's hands moved faster now, her signs growing more fluid as she fell into the telling. "I saw a man on horseback. He had dismounted. A girl was on the ground. He was standing over her." She paused, her hands shaping the next signs with deliberate care. "He wore a gray wool coat with brass buttons. He had a silver ring on his left hand. His horse was a bay mare with a white star on her forehead." Landon translated each sign, his voice steady, and the courtroom was silent. Garrett nodded from his seat, confirming each translation. Thalia continued. "The man struck the girl when she tried to run. He tore her dress. She fought him. He hit her again. I wanted to help. I was afraid." "I am ashamed of that." "No shame in survival," the magistrate said quietly. "Continue." Thalia's hands moved through the rest of the account, describing how the attack had unfolded, how the girl had finally broken free and run, how the man had remounted his horse and ridden back toward the village. Then she signed. "I saw his face in the moonlight. I know that face. He destroyed my voice years ago. He is Matthias Garrett." Landon translated the last signs, his voice ringing in the silent room, and every eye turned to Garrett. The man's face had gone rigid, his mouth a thin line. His lawyer stood again. "This is a fabrication. She is lying to seek revenge for some imagined slight." Thalia's hands snapped up, her signs sharp and angry. Landon translated. "Not imagined, real. He was overseer on the flax plantation in Red Hill Province. He whipped me for speaking out of turn. The whip caught my throat. My voice bled away. I have the scar." Before anyone could stop her, Thalia pulled down the collar of her dress, exposing her throat. A thick, pale scar ran across her neck, ragged and old, the kind of scar that came from a wound that should have killed. The courtroom gasped. Matthias Garrett went white. The magistrate leaned forward. "Mr. Garrett, do you deny that you served as overseer on a plantation in Red Hill Province?" Garrett's lawyer whispered urgently in his ear, but Garrett pushed him aside. "I served as overseer, yes. It is no secret. But I never maimed anyone. She must have gotten that scar some other way." Thalia signed again, and Landon translated. "Records. Plantation keeps records. Injury reports. I filed one. He made me sign it, said it was my own clumsiness, but the record exists." The magistrate made a note. "We will subpoena those records. In the meantime, Miss Fenn, can you corroborate the details of the coat and horse?" Hallie stood from the gallery. "I can, Your Honor. Magistrate Garrett rides a bay mare with a white star. I have seen her in his stable. He wore a gray coat with brass buttons the day he came to my farm to discuss grain taxes." The magistrate looked at Garrett, his expression grave. "Mr. Garrett, the evidence is mounting. Do you wish to respond?" Garrett's composure cracked. "You are going to take the word of a mute orc and a traumatized girl over a magistrate of the court. This is an outrage. I have served this region with honor. I will not be slandered by your victims." The magistrate interrupted, his voice cold. "Sit down, Mr. Garrett." He turned to his clerk. Send for the records from Red Hill Province. This court will reconvene in 1 week to review them. Until then, Mr. Garrett, you are remanded to custody to ensure you do not flee or interfere with witnesses. The courtroom erupted in shouts and arguments. Garrett's lawyer was on his feet objecting, but the magistrate's bailiff was already moving to take Garrett into custody. Garrett looked at Thalia as the bailiff took his arm, his eyes filled with a venom that made Landon step between them instinctively. "You will regret this," Garrett said, his voice low and shaking. "Both of you." "Threatening witnesses in open court," the magistrate said, his tone disgusted. "Take him away." Garrett was led out, still shouting, and the courtroom slowly emptied. Thalia stood frozen at the front, her hands shaking, and Landon touched her shoulder gently. She turned to him, and her hands moved in a single sign. "Did we do it?" "You did it," Landon signed back. "You spoke. They heard you." Thalia's eyes filled with tears, and she pressed her hands to her face. Landon guided her to a bench in the empty courtroom and sat beside her, not touching, just present, and waited until her shoulders stopped shaking. When she finally looked up, her hands moved slowly. "Thank you for learning my words. Thank you for teaching them," Landon signed back. The week that followed was strange and tense. The village was divided, some people outraged that a magistrate had been accused, others grimly satisfied that justice was finally being pursued. Landon and Thalia stayed close to the apothecary, working through the days and talking in signs through the evenings, their conversations growing deeper as the weight of what they had done settled over them. Landon found himself noticing things he had not let himself notice before. The way Thalia's eyes crinkled when she laughed silently. The way her hands moved with an elegance that had nothing to do with language and everything to do with her. The way she leaned slightly toward him when they sat together, as if drawn by some invisible thread. One night as they sat by the fire in his small kitchen, Thalia signed, "Why did you help me? You could have stayed silent, safer." Landon thought about it, watching the flames cast shadows across her face. "Because you deserve to be heard," he signed. "Because I have spent my whole life believing words were useless, and you showed me I was wrong. Words matter. Yours matter." Thalia looked at him, her eyes reflecting the firelight, and signed, "You matter too." Landon felt something in his chest crack open, some wall he had built so long ago he had forgotten it was there. He reached out slowly, giving her time to pull away, and took her hand. Her fingers curled around his, warm and strong, and they sat like that in the firelight, holding on. The reconvened hearing brought the records from Red Hill Province. They were dusty ledgers, pages yellowed with age, but the entry was there. Injury to worker Thalia Fenn, cause listed as accident with plantation equipment, signed by overseer Matthias Garrett. The magistrate also brought a physician who specialized in scarring, and the physician examined Thalia's throat and testified that the scar was consistent with a whip strike, not machinery, and that it was a miracle she had survived at all. Garrett's lawyer tried to argue that the injury did not prove Garrett had committed the recent attack, but the magistrate was unmoved. "The pattern is clear," Magistrate Thorne said. "Mr. Garrett has a history of violence against those he perceives as powerless." Miss Fenn's testimony, corroborated by physical evidence and her detailed knowledge of the attack, is credible. Combined with Miss Emma Hallie's testimony and the physical evidence Mr. Zeller documented, the court finds Matthias Garrett guilty of assault and attempted violation. He is sentenced to 10 years of hard labor and permanent removal from any position of authority. The courtroom erupted in applause and angry shouts in equal measure. Garrett sat slumped in his chair, his face gray. Emma Hallie's wept in her father's arms. Thalia stood very still, her hands loose at her sides, and Landon saw the moment the tension finally drained out of her. She looked at him and signed. "It is over. It is over," he signed back. They walked back to the apothecary through streets that felt lighter somehow, as if the air itself had changed. When they reached the shop, Thalia stopped at the door and turned to Landon. Her hands moved, hesitant. "I have nowhere to live now. I was renting a room, but the landlord told me to leave after the hearing. Too much trouble." Landon did not hesitate. "Stay here. There is a room above the shop. It is small but clean. It is yours if you want it." Thalia stared at him. "Why? You have done so much already." "Because I do not want you to leave," Landon signed, the words coming out more honestly than he had intended. "Because I am tired of living alone. Because he stopped, his hands faltering, and then made himself finish. "Because I care about you." Thalia's eyes widened. She signed slowly. "You care about me. Even though I am orc, even though I bring trouble, I care about you because you are you," Landon signed. "The rest does not matter." Thalia stepped forward and wrapped her arms around him, and Landon held her, feeling her shake with silent tears against his shoulder. When she finally pulled back, her hands moved with a fierceness that took his breath away. "I care about you too, more than I know how to say." "Then stay," Landon signed. "Say it here, with me." She nodded, and he led her inside, up the narrow stairs to the room that had been storage and would now be hers. It was dusty and cluttered, but they spent the evening clearing it out, and by nightfall it was clean and furnished with a bed and a chest and a small window that looked out over the garden. Thalia stood at the window, her hands resting on the sill, and signed. "This is more than I ever hoped for." "It is just a beginning," Landon signed back. They fell into a new rhythm after that. Thalia lived above the shop and worked beside Landon every day, and in the evenings they cooked together and talked in signs by the fire, their conversations ranging from the mundane to the profound. Landon taught her the names of constellations, and she taught him songs she remembered from before her voice was taken, shaping the melodies with her hands in patterns that somehow conveyed the music. They argued about the best way to prepare willow bark tea and laughed silently over burnt bread and spilled tinctures. Landon found himself happier than he had ever been, and the realization was both exhilarating and terrifying. One night in late spring, as the garden burst into bloom and the air smelled of apple blossoms and fresh earth, Landon and Thalia sat on the bench outside the apothecary, watching the stars come out. Landon had been working up the courage for weeks to ask the question that had been circling in his mind, and finally he made himself sign it. "Do you ever wish you could speak? With your voice, I mean?" Thalia considered the question, her hands still in her lap. Then she signed. "Sometimes. I miss singing. I miss the sound of my own laughter, but I do not miss the world that took my voice. And I do not miss the person I was before, the one who thought she had to be small and quiet to survive." She paused, then signed. "You taught me I can be loud without a voice. My hands can shout." Landon smiled, the kind of smile he rarely allowed himself, and signed. "They shout very well." Thalia's hands moved with sudden intensity. "I want to say something important. I do not know the right signs for it." "Try," Landon signed. She took a breath, her eyes locked on his, and her hands shaped the words carefully. "I love you. I think I have loved you since you first signed good morning and got it wrong. I love you for learning my language. I love you for standing beside me when no one else would. I love you." Landon felt his throat tighten. He had not cried since his father died, but he felt the burn of tears now. He signed back, his hands trembling. "I love you too. I did not know I was lonely until you arrived. I did not know I was waiting until you came." Thalia kissed him then, her hands framing his face, and Landon kissed her back, tasting salt from the tears on both their faces. When they finally pulled apart, they sat with their foreheads pressed together, breathing in sync, and Landon thought that he had spent his whole life learning the wrong languages, and only now, with her, had he found the one that mattered. The summer passed in a haze of work and contentment. The apothecary thrived, word spreading that the herbalist and his orc assistant were skilled and fair, and people came from villages a day's ride away to buy their medicines. Thalia's presence was still remarked upon, still drew stares and whispers, but Landon met every suspicious look with a steady gaze, and Thalia met every doubt with competence. Slowly, grudgingly, the village began to accept her. Garrett, the old farmhand, took to stopping by the shop every week, sitting in the garden and signing with Thalia for hours, the two of them laughing silently over some joke Landon could not quite follow. Emma Hallies came by too, bringing her mother and younger siblings, and Thalia taught Emma the basics of sign language so they could talk without Landon translating. It built a community, these small connections, and Landon watched it happen with quiet amazement. In the autumn, Landon asked Thalia to marry him. He did it in the garden at dawn, the air crisp and the frost sparkling on the last of the asters. He had practiced the signs 100 times, but his hands still shook as he shaped the question. Will you marry me? Will you build a life with me here in this place we made together? Thalia's hands flew to her mouth, her eyes wide and shining. Then she signed, fast and joyful, yes, yes, 1,000 times yes. They were married a month later in a small ceremony in the village square, with Garrett and Emma and Hallies and his family as witnesses. The village priest, an old man who had known Landon since he was a child, performed the rites with a faint smile, and when he asked if Thalia took Landon as her husband, she signed, I do, and Landon translated aloud, his voice firm. When the priest pronounced them wed, Thalia kissed Landon with a fierceness that made the small crowd cheer, and Landon felt a happiness so complete it was almost painful. They moved Thalia's few belongings into Landon's room, and the house that had been so silent for so long filled with the quiet sounds of shared life. The creak of the floorboards as Thalia walked to the window each morning, the rustle of pages as she read by lamplight, the clink of spoons as they cooked together. They spoke in signs even when words were easier, because the language was theirs, private and perfect. Landon found himself learning new signs every day, inventing ones they needed that did not exist, and Thalia did the same, and their shared language grew rich and strange and utterly their own. Winter came again, and with it the quiet season when the garden slept and the apothecary work slowed. Landon and Thalia spent long evenings by the fire, Landon reading aloud from books while Thalia sowed or sorted seeds for the spring planting. One night, as the snow fell thick outside the windows, Thalia set down her sewing and signed, I am happy. I did not know I could be this happy. Landon set down his book and signed back, neither did I. She smiled, that full smile that showed her tusks, and signed, we are lucky. We found each other. We made each other, Landon signed. You taught me to listen without ears. I taught you to shout without a voice. We made this. Thalia moved to sit beside him, curling into his side, and Landon wrapped his arm around her. They sat like that for a long time, watching the fire burn down to embers, and Landon thought about the twisting path that had led them here, about all the small choices and chances that had brought a man who did not speak and a woman who could not speak into each other's lives. It felt like fate, but it also felt like work, like something they had built together sign by sign, word by word, until they had created a language that was entirely theirs. Spring arrived with a rush of green and a flood of work. The garden needed planting, the shop needed restocking, and Landon and Thalia threw themselves into the labor with a contentment that came from knowing they were building something lasting. Garrett brought them seedlings from his farm. Emma brought them honey from her father's hives. And slowly the small community they had built around the apothecary grew stronger. One warm afternoon in late spring, as Landon and Thalia worked side by side planting basil and thyme, Thalia paused and signed, "I have news." Landon looked up from the dirt, brushing soil from his hands. "Good news or bad news?" Thalia's hands moved slowly, her face glowing. "Good news. I am pregnant." Landon stared at her, the words taking a moment to register, and then he was on his feet, pulling her into his arms, lifting her off the ground and spinning her once before setting her down gently, suddenly worried he had been too rough. Thalia laughed her silent laugh, her whole body shaking with it, and signed, "I am not fragile." "I know," Landon signed back, his hands giddy and clumsy. "I know, but you are carrying our child. I am allowed to be careful. You are allowed to be happy," Thalia signed, taking his hands in hers. "I am happy," Landon signed. "I am so happy I do not have words for it." "Good thing we have hands," Thalia signed, grinning. The months that followed were filled with preparation. Landon read every book on childbirth and infant care he could find, and Thalia knitted tiny clothes and blankets, her hands moving with the same precision she brought to everything. The village women, even those who had been standoffish before, began to stop by with advice and hand-me-down cradles and offers of help. It was a shift, subtle but real, as if Thalia's pregnancy had made her undeniably human in their eyes, a mother like any other. Thalia found it both amusing and frustrating, and she signed to Landon one evening, "They accept me now because I am making a baby, as if that is all that matters." "It is not all that matters," Landon signed. "But it is a start. Let them learn. They will see the rest eventually." Thalia nodded, mollified, and went back to knitting. The baby came in early winter, a long and difficult labor that left Landon terrified and helpless. The midwife, a sturdy woman named Marge who had delivered half the babies in the village, took over with brisk efficiency, and Landon was relegated to boiling water and staying out of the way. When the baby finally arrived, a squalling, red-faced boy with a shock of dark hair and tiny tusks just beginning to bud, Landon felt his knees go weak with relief. Marge cleaned the baby and wrapped him in a blanket, then placed him in Thalia's arms. Thalia looked down at her son, her face alight with a wonder that made Landon's chest ache, and then she looked up at Landon and signed with one hand, the baby cradled in the other, "Our son." Landon knelt beside the bed and touched the baby's tiny hand, marveling at the perfect miniature fingers. "What should we name him?" he signed. Thalia thought for a moment, then signed, "Finn. It means fair. A good name for a boy who will grow up in a fair world." "Finn," Landon repeated aloud, tasting the name. "Finn Zeller, I like it." Finn grew quickly, a bright and curious child who learned to sign before he learned to speak, his small hands mimicking his mother's gestures with increasing accuracy. When he was 2, he began to babble words as well, and the house became a bilingual place where signs and speech mingled freely. Landon and Thalia taught him both, wanting him to move easily between their worlds. Finn adored his mother, following her through the garden and the shop, and he adored his father, sitting on Landon's lap while Landon read to him or mixed medicines. He was a happy child, quick to laugh and slow to anger, and Landon often looked at him and thought about the miracle of his existence, this boy who was proof that 2 people who had been so alone could build a family. When Finn was 4, Thalia became pregnant again, and this time the pregnancy was easier, the labor shorter. Their second son was born on a bright spring morning, and they named him Soren, a name that meant stern but which seemed ironic given the baby's constant smile. Soren was quieter than Finn, more contemplative, but he had the same quick hands and the same love of the garden. Landon and Thalia adapted to the chaos of two young children with a patience that surprised them both, and the apothecary continued to thrive. Finn and Soren often playing in the corner of the shop while their parents worked. Years passed in this way, seasons turning and the boys growing. Finn became a serious child, interested in plants and medicine, following Landon around and asking endless questions. Soren became a dreamer, spending hours lying in the grass and watching clouds, his hands moving in signs that narrated the stories he invented. Thalia taught them both to be kind, to be brave, to stand up for those who could not stand up for themselves. Landon taught them to be curious, to question, to never accept cruelty as inevitable. One evening, when Finn was 8 and Soren was 4, the family sat together in the garden watching the fireflies blink in the dusk. Finn signed to his mother, "Why do people stare at you in the village?" Thalia glanced at Landon, and he nodded slightly. She signed back to Finn, her hands clear and steady. "Because I am different, I am an orc. Some people fear difference." "But you are kind," Finn signed, his small face confused. "Why does it matter that you are different?" "It should not matter," Thalia signed, "but to some people it does. That is why it is important to be kind, even when others are not kind to you. Kindness is stronger than fear." Finn thought about this, his expression solemn, then nodded. Soren, who had been watching the fireflies, signed, "I think you are beautiful, Mama." Thalia's eyes filled with tears, and she pulled both boys into her lap, holding them close. Landon watched them, his heart full to bursting, and thought about how far they had come, how much they had built from the silence and the pain they had started with. The boys grew older and the village grew more accepting. The stares faded, the whispers stopped, and Thalia became simply the herbalist's wife, the mother of Finn and Soren, a woman respected for her skill and her kindness. When Finn was 12, he began helping in the shop officially, learning to mix tinctures and identify plants by their leaves and roots. Soren, at 8, preferred the garden, and he took over the planting and harvesting with an instinctive understanding of what each plant needed. Landon and Thalia watched their sons grow into their own people, and they were proud. One night, as Landon and Thalia lay in bed, the house quiet around them, Thalia signed, "Do you ever regret it? Learning my hands?" Landon turned to her, surprised. "Never. Why would I? It changed your life. Made it more complicated, brought trouble to your door." "It brought you to my door," Landon signed. "That is the best thing that ever happened to me. I would learn 100 languages if it meant finding you." Thalia smiled, her eyes soft in the moonlight. "I would lose my voice 100 times if it meant you would learn to hear me." "You should not have to lose anything," Landon signed, his hands fierce. "You should have had a life where no one hurt you, where your voice was never taken." "Maybe," Thalia signed, "but then I would not have you. I would not have our sons. I would not have this life, and I would not trade this life for anything." Landon kissed her, slow and tender, and they lay together in the quiet, their hands resting together on the blanket between them, fingers intertwined. Years continued to pass, steady and full. Finn grew into a young man, tall and serious, with his father's calm demeanor and his mother's fierce sense of justice. He took over more of the apothecary work, allowing Landon to slow down as his joints began to ache with age. Soren grew into a young man as well, quieter but no less passionate, and he expanded the garden until it was the largest in the village, supplying not just the apothecary but half the households in the area. Both boys were fluent in sign language, and they often served as translators when Thalia needed to communicate with customers who did not know signs, though by then many in the village had learned at least basic signs out of respect and practicality. When Finn was 20, He met a girl named Clara, the daughter of the baker, and he courted her with a sweetness that reminded Landon of himself. Clara learned sign language to speak with Thalia, and Thalia taught her to make salves and tinctures, and when Finn and Clara married, Thalia wept silent tears of joy. Soren, at 16, was still finding his way, but he was kind and thoughtful, and Landon had no doubt he would find his path when the time was right. One autumn evening, as the leaves turned gold and the air smelled of apples and wood smoke, Landon and Thalia sat together on the bench outside the apothecary, the same bench where they had sat so many years ago, when she had first told him she loved him. They were older now, their hair threaded with gray, their hands marked with the scars and calluses of a lifetime of work, but they still fit together perfectly, her head on his shoulder, his arm around her waist. Thalia signed, "We built a good life." Landon signed back, "We built a great life. The boys are happy, the shop is thriving, the garden is beautiful, we did well." "You did well," Landon signed. "You survived, you fought, you won." Thalia smiled and signed, "We won, together." Landon nodded, and they sat in silence, watching the sun set over the garden they had planted together, the shop they had built together, the family they had raised together. The language they had created, the private tongue of their hands, had become the foundation of everything they were. And Landon thought about how strange and wonderful it was that a man who had never trusted words and a woman who had lost her voice had found a way to say everything that mattered. As the stars began to appear one by one, Thalia signed, "I am tired. Let us go inside." Landon helped her to her feet, and they walked into the house, into the warm glow of the lamps and the familiar scent of herbs and home. Finn and Clara were in the kitchen, making dinner, and Soren was at the table, sketching plans for a new section of the garden. The house was full of life and laughter, silent and spoken, and Landon and Thalia moved through it with the ease of people who had spent decades learning each other's rhythms. That night, as they lay in bed, Thalia signed, "Thank you." "For what?" Landon signed. "For seeing me. For hearing me. For loving me." "Thank you for the same," Landon signed back. They fell asleep holding hands, and in the morning they woke to another day in the life they had built, another day of work and love and the quiet conversations of their hands. It was not a life without pain or struggle, but it was a life they had chosen, a life they had fought for, and it was good. The seasons turned and the years piled up, and Landon and Thalia grew old together in the house by the apothecary, surrounded by the garden they had planted and the family they had raised. They taught their grandchildren to sign, and their grandchildren taught their friends, and slowly the village became a place where sign language was as common as speech, a place where silence was not absence but presence, where people learned to listen with their eyes and speak with their hands. And when Landon, at the age of 74, lay in bed with his heart failing and his breath growing shallow, Thalia sat beside him and held his hand, and their fingers moved together in the language only they knew, saying all the things they had said 1,000 times and needed to say once more. "I love you," Landon's fingers spelled out, shaking and weak. "I love you," Thalia's fingers answered, strong and sure. And when his hand finally went still, she held it for a long time, her silent tears falling onto their joined fingers, and she thought about the man who had learned her hands and given her a voice louder than any sound. Thalia lived another 5 years after Landon died, and in that time she taught sign language to everyone who would learn, spreading the language that had saved her across the village and beyond. She told the story of how Landon had studied her signs in secret, how he had stood beside her in court, how he had translated her testimony and given her justice, and people listened with the respect due to a legend. When Thalia finally passed, At the age of 76, she was buried beside Landon in the village cemetery, and on her headstone Finn and Soren carved a message in signs, the symbols etched into stone so that anyone who knew the language could read it. She spoke with her hands, and the world learned to listen. The apothecary continued, passed down through generations, and the garden continued to bloom every spring. And the language that Landon and Thalia had built together became a legacy, a gift to everyone who had ever felt unheard, and proof that love does not need a voice to speak, only hands willing to learn and hearts willing to listen.